The sun bled crimson across the stark plains, painting the rocks of Whisperwind Canyon in hues of sacrifice. He was a warrior, Kachi, his hands more accustomed to the grip of a lance, the weight of a bow, not the fragile helplessness of a newborn child. Yet there he knelt, dust and sweat streaking his stoic face, before a dying settler woman, her life ebbing into the parched earth. Her eyes, filled with a mother's desperate fire, locked onto his. A plea, barely a whisper, that would shatter his world and forge an unbreakable vow. What followed would become a legend, a testament to an honor that knew no boundaries, born in the heart of the untamed West. Could he, a man of the Comanche, navigate the treacherous path ahead, shield this innocent life from the storm of violence that claimed its mother, and perhaps, just perhaps, find a sliver of redemption in the flames? The answer lay hidden in the dust, waiting to be disturbed. Kachi was a man apart, even among his own people. His gaze, sharp as a hawk's, missed little. He moved with a quiet grace that belied the coiled strength within him, a strength honed by loss and the unforgiving land. A shadow of a past sorrow clung to him, setting him on solitary paths, often leading him to the high crags of Hawk's Peak Mountain. From there, he would watch the distant plume of smoke that was Havenwood, a fledgling settlement carved out by newcomers. He felt no hatred for them, only a weary understanding of the changing tides. Their presence was a stark reminder of a shrinking world, yet his heart was not entirely calloused. He remembered a time when his own world had been shattered, a memory that resonated with an empathy he rarely showed. Miles away, unaware of the warrior who sometimes observed their kind, Sarah and David Miller rumbled towards Havenwood in their sturdy wagon. Their faces, though etched with the weariness of the trail, shone with the light of new beginnings. David, a strong man with kind eyes, often spoke of the Bar M Ranch, a piece of land his father, Martin, had toiled to secure. It was their inheritance, their dream, nestled in a valley said to be blessed with good water and fertile soil. They carried with them not just tools and supplies, but the deed to this future, a testament to a life they planned to build. They were good people, hoping for peace, blind to the darkness that coveted their dream. For the name Marcus Slade was already a venomous whisper in the region, a man whose ambition was as vast and merciless as the plains themselves. His Red River reavers were a plague, and their shadow was lengthening, inching closer to the unsuspecting Millers and the small community of Havenwood. The air, even in its stillness, held a gathering storm. The storm broke with the ferocity of a rabid wolf. Marcus Slade and his reavers descended upon the Miller wagon, not with a demand, but with a savage intent to erase. David, roaring defiance, fought to protect Sarah, to give her a chance, any chance. He fell, his lifeblood soaking into the thirsty ground, buying his wife mere moments. Sarah, a terrible pain lancing through her side, a deeper agony tearing at her soul, scrambled away from the carnage, the shouts of the reavers fading behind her as she plunged into the labyrinthine embrace of Whisperwind Canyon. She knew then, with a chilling certainty, that her time was short. The life within her, however, fought to be born. Kachi had been tracking Slade's men for 2 suns. Their brazen incursions into Comanche hunting grounds, their wanton slaughter of game, had stirred a cold anger within him. He moved like a phantom through the broken land, his senses alive, when the scent of smoke and fresh blood reached him. He found the smoldering remnants of the wagon first, the brutal tableau of Slade's work. His jaw tightened, a familiar coldness settling in his gut. Then, a sound, faint, almost lost in the wind, a cry of profound suffering. He followed it deeper into the canyon, his warrior's instincts guiding him. And there she was, Sarah Miller, backed against a sandstone outcrop, blood pooling beneath her. Her face was pale, contorted in pain, but her eyes burned with an unyielding light as she looked down at the squirming, crying infant in her arms, a boy born amidst chaos and death. She saw Kachi approach, a figure of formidable power, an enemy by all common understanding. Yet desperation stripped away all such notions. "Please," she gasped, her voice a fragile thread. She thrust the baby towards him, her arms trembling violently. "His name! Samuel! Save him! Please! Vow to me! Save my son!" Kachi froze. The air crackled with the raw intensity of her plea. His world, ordered by tribal law, by warrior codes, by ancient enmities, tilted on its axis. He saw not a settler, an adversary, but a mother, fierce and broken. He saw the infant, innocent, thrust into a brutal world. He saw her life fading, her gaze clinging to him, her only hope. Conflict warred within him, a maelstrom of duty, pity, and a strange, aching recognition. His own past, the faces of those he had lost, flickered in his mind's eye. Slowly, almost reverently, he knelt. His large, calloused hand, a hand that had taken life, reached out and gently touched the baby's downy head. The infant's cries hitched. Sarah's breath caught in a ragged sob of fragile relief. "I vow it," Kachi said, his voice raspy, foreign even to his own ears. "He will live." A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips. Her eyes, still fixed on her son, softened. Then, with a final, shuddering sigh, her spirit fled, leaving Kachi alone with the crying child and the weight of an oath that would forever bind him. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the baby's wails and the distant howl of a coyote, a lament for the fallen, and perhaps a herald of the perilous journey ahead. The warrior's hands, steady in battle, were clumsy as he lifted Samuel. The baby was so small, so vulnerable. Kachi looked down at the infant, a knot tightening in his chest. This was not his world, this act of tending. His path was one of solitude, of swift action, not gentle care. Yet, the vow resonated deep within his spirit, an anchor in a suddenly turbulent sea. He fashioned a crude sling from a piece of Sarah's shawl he found near her, securing Samuel against his chest. The warmth of the child, the faint, milky scent, was an alien sensation. His first challenge was immediate. Survival. Not his own, for the plains were a harsh mother he knew well, but the baby's. He found a shallow cave, hidden behind a fall of scree, offering shelter from the biting night wind and the predators that roamed the canyons. He used his flint and steel to coax a small, smokeless fire from dry scrub, the tiny flame a fragile bastion against the encroaching darkness. Milk, the child would need milk. But from where? He was miles from any settlement, and his own village was too far, too uncertain a reception for a white child. Kachi's mind, trained to hunt and fight, now raced to solve this new, desperate problem. He remembered seeing a doe with a very young fawn earlier. It was a risk, a depletion of game he would normally avoid, but the vow demanded it. With Samuel bundled securely nearby, Kachi moved with lethal quietness, his bow singing once. He returned not with meat for himself, but with the doe, and carefully, awkwardly, managed to express a little of its warm milk into a cleaned turtle shell he carried for water. It was a poor substitute, but Samuel, after some initial resistance, drank weakly. Days blurred into a routine of desperate improvisation. Kachi hunted, not just for sustenance, but for anything that could aid the child. He learned to crush berries and mix them with water, to find the softest furs for bedding. He cleaned Samuel with wetted moss, his large hands surprisingly gentle. He spoke to the child in the low, guttural tones of the Comanche. Not words of comfort as a mother would, but stories of the wind, the stars, the hawk soaring free above Hawk's Peak Mountain. And slowly, miraculously, Samuel began to quiet in his presence, his tiny fingers sometimes gripping Kachi's own. But the shadow of Marcus Slade and his Red River Reavers loomed large. Kachi, even burdened with the child, did not abandon his vigilance. He made short, cautious scouting trips. His senses stretched taut. He saw the smoke from burning homesteads, heard the distant, chilling echoes of gunfire. Slade was not merely raiding. He was cleansing the land, his brutality methodical, and his men were searching. Kachi saw their patrols, more numerous now, their movements less random. They were sweeping the area, as if looking for something, or someone, they had missed. Were they looking for Sarah? For the child? Or something else she might have carried? The thought sent a chill down Kachi's spine. His vow was not just to keep Samuel alive, but to keep him safe. And safety was a forgotten word in a land under Slade's terror. Kachi knew then that this was more than a rescue. It was the beginning of a hunt, and he and the child were the prey. His observation of Slade transformed from a warrior's assessment of an encroaching enemy to a guardian's desperate need to understand a predator. Slade, back in his rough-hewn fortress at the stolen Bar M ranch, paced like a caged wolf. News had reached him. A whisper from a scout who'd found signs. Signs that the Miller woman might not have perished in Whisperwind Canyon immediately. And worse, the scout had found the tiny, discarded remnants of a newborn swaddling. A baby. Slade's face, already cruel, twisted into a mask of fury. It wasn't just about silencing a witness. Sarah Miller, or her husband David, had carried something he desperately needed. The original deed to the Bar M. The document that proved his claim was built on lies and blood. Without it, his burgeoning empire, built around the ranch's crucial water source, the only reliable one for 50 miles, was vulnerable. Find them. Slade snarled at his enforcers, his voice a lash. A woman, perhaps wounded, and a baby. There's a bounty, a rich one, for whoever brings them to me, or brings me proof they're fertilizer for the buzzards. He particularly emphasized wanting anything they might have carried. Search every homestead, every gully. Question everyone in Havenwood. Someone must have seen something. The Red River Reavers, spurred by their leader's cold rage and the promise of reward, intensified their brutal campaign. They swarmed through the territory, their presence a suffocating blanket of fear. Havenwood, small and isolated, felt the pressure most acutely. Men were beaten, supplies stolen, and a pall of terror settled over the dusty streets. Kachi, carrying Samuel, moved like a spirit through the harshest terrain, his knowledge of the hidden paths and secret waterholes keeping them alive. He saw the increased patrols, the smoke from new fires, heard the frightened whispers carried on the wind from fleeing settlers. There were close calls. Once, a Reaver patrol passed so near their hiding spot in a thicket of thorny mesquite that Kachi could hear their coarse laughter, smell the stale sweat and whiskey on them. He'd held Samuel tightly, one hand gently covering the baby's mouth, his heart a cold drum against his ribs. The baby, as if sensing the danger, had remained silent, his wide eyes fixed on Kachi's. The bond between the stoic warrior and the orphan child deepened with each shared hardship, each narrow escape. Kachi found himself watching Samuel sleep, a strange ache in his chest that was not entirely unpleasant. He would carve small figures from scraps of wood, a hawk, a wolf, and watch as Samuel's tiny hands reached for them. He was still a warrior, fierce and capable, but the sharp edges of his solitude were being subtly reshaped by the innocent life in his care. His quiet observation of Slade's men was no longer passive. He began to actively mislead them. laying false trails, creating diversions. He was not just hiding, he was fighting back, in his own silent, deadly way. The vow was a living thing now, pulsing with a fierce, protective fire. He had to understand why Slade was so desperate. It was more than just a surviving woman and child. There was something more, something that drove Slade's relentless pursuit. Weeks turned into months. Samuel was growing, no longer a fragile newborn but a sturdy infant, his eyes bright with curiosity. Kachi had managed, through immense effort and his profound understanding of the natural world, to keep him nourished and safe. He'd found a nanny goat with a kid, and after carefully observing, managed to secure the goat, ensuring a more reliable source of milk for Samuel. He'd made a more permanent, hidden camp in a series of small caves high on the slopes of Hawks Peak Mountain, a place few ever dared to venture. One evening, as the last rays of the sun painted the sky, Kachi was examining the few meager possessions he'd taken from Sarah Miller's side, items he'd kept bundled with Samuel. He'd looked through them before, finding little of apparent value beyond a few coins and a worn Bible. But this time, his fingers brushed against something stiff, hidden within the lining of a small, oilskin pouch that had held a locket. Carefully, he worked it free. Inside was a folded document, brittle with age, and a letter. Kachi, whose dealings with traders and sometimes treaties had forced him to learn the white man's script, albeit slowly, spread the paper out in the dim light of his small fire. The document was a deed. The official markings, the signatures, the detailed description of land boundaries. It was the original title to the Bar M Ranch. Signed over from the Bar M Ranch. Signed over from the Bar M Ranch. Kachi produced the oilskin packet. He explained what he knew, what he'd found. He spoke of Samuel, of Sarah's dying plea. Amos listened, his expression unchanging. But Kachi saw the flicker of interest, the hardening of his jaw. Slade's built himself a kingdom on that water, Amos said finally. If that deed is real, it could bring him down. But it'll take more than paper. It'll take blood. I know, Kachi replied. Slade has many guns. But the people of Havenwood, they suffer. They fear. Give them a reason to fight, a chance to reclaim their lives, and they might find their courage. Amos considered this. They're scared, but some are getting desperate. Slade's tightening the noose. He looked at Kachi, a new respect in his eyes. A Comanche warrior fighting for a settler child's birthright. The world's gone mad. Or maybe, he added with a grim smile, it's starting to make sense. Over the next few days, Amos, using Kachi's information and the potent symbol of the deed, began to quietly rally support. He spoke to the blacksmith whose son Slade's men had beaten, to the storekeeper whose supplies were constantly extorted, to the quiet farmers who saw their hopes dying. He even reached out to a small group of Kachi's own people, warriors led by a young brave named Tonkawa, who saw Slade's unchecked power as a blight that would eventually consume them all if not stopped. The promise of reclaiming stolen horses and striking a blow against the Reavers was a powerful motivator. The plan was daring, bordering on suicidal, but it was their only chance. They would use the annual Founders' Day celebration Slade was planning at the Bar M, a grotesque display of his supposed benevolence, as cover. While Slade and his core men were distracted, a small, determined force led by Kachi and Amos, bolstered by Tonkawa's warriors and a handful of armed townsfolk, would infiltrate the ranch. Their objective: secure the main house, find Slade's own fabricated land documents, and confront him publicly with the true deed and with Samuel, the living heir. The day of the Founders' Day celebration dawned hot and still. The Bar M was abuzz with activity. Though the merriment was forced, the settlers attending more out of fear than festivity. Slade, preening in a new suit, held court, oblivious to the storm gathering on his horizon. As dusk began to settle, Kachi, Amos, and their small band moved like shadows. Tonkawa's warriors, using their knowledge of infiltration, disabled sentries at the perimeter. Kachi, his senses heightened, led the way to a seldom-used service entrance at the rear of the main ranch house. Inside, the sounds of Slade's party were a dull roar. They moved swiftly, neutralizing the few guards inside. Amos, who knew the layout of the house from before Slade's takeover, led them to Slade's office. It was gaudily furnished, a testament to stolen wealth. While Amos searched for Slade's forged papers, Kachi stood by the window, watching the courtyard, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. He carried Samuel, now a toddler of nearly 2 years, in a sling on his back. The boy quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. Amos gave a grunt of satisfaction, holding up a sheaf of documents. Got him. His fake deeds. It is time, Kachi said. They emerged from the house just as Slade was making a pompous speech, raising a glass to his prosperity. Kachi stepped into the firelight, Amos beside him. A hush fell over the crowd. Slade's eyes narrowed, surprise quickly turning to murderous rage. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Slade bellowed, his hand inching towards his gun. Seize them! These men are here under my protection, Slade. Amos's voice boomed, clear and strong, and several of the Havenwood men with him raised their rifles. Slade's reivers, surprised, hesitated. Kachi stepped forward, holding up Martin Miller's deed. This land is not yours, Slade. It belongs to the son of David Miller. He turned slightly, revealing Samuel on his back. The child, blinking in the light, looked out at the stunned faces. A collective gasp went through the assembled settlers. Lies, Slade shrieked, his composure shattering. That's a forgery. The Millers are dead. I own this ranch. He drew his pistol. But Tonkawa and his warriors chose that moment to emerge from the shadows surrounding the courtyard, their bows drawn, arrows aimed at Slade's reivers. The standoff was complete. The only forgery here, Slade, Amos said, throwing the papers he'd found onto the ground. Are these deeds you concocted? We have witnesses to your murders, to your thefts. Slade, cornered and exposed, desperation etched on his face, made a fatal error. He lunged not for Kachi, but toward Samuel, a wild look in his eyes, perhaps to snatch the child as a shield, or to silence the last Miller. Kachi moved with blurring speed. He pushed Samuel safely behind him with one arm, while his other hand drew his long knife. Slade, overreaching, stumbled. Kachi didn't hesitate. There was no honor in Slade, no warrior's code to respect. There was only a rabid animal to be put down. The fight was brutal and swift. Slade, for all his bluster, was no match for the Comanche warrior's focused fury. A choked cry, and Marcus Slade, the tyrant of the plains, fell into the dust of the ranch he had stolen, his own blood now staining the land. A stunned silence followed. Then a ragged cheer went up from the settlers. Slade's reivers, seeing their leader fall and finding themselves surrounded, threw down their weapons. Justice, swift and raw, had come to the Bar M. In the aftermath, chaos gave way to a fragile order. Slade's gang was rounded up. Their reign of terror decisively ended. The Bar M Ranch, its true ownership now undisputed, became a beacon of hope rather than a den of thieves. Young Samuel Miller, too young to understand the monumental events that had secured his future, was placed under the temporary care of a kind woman from Havenwood, with Amos Cutter agreeing to act as foreman and protector of the boy's interests until he came of age. Kachi watched it all, a quiet figure on the periphery. His vow to Sarah Miller was fulfilled. The child was safe, his birthright secured. He could have faded back into the wilderness, returned to his solitary life on Hawks Peak Mountain. But something had shifted within him. The emptiness that had once defined his existence had been filled by the unwavering purpose of his promise. and by the unexpected bond with the boy. He did not leave immediately. He stayed long enough to ensure the transition was smooth, his presence a silent deterrent against any lingering remnants of Slade's influence. He taught Amos some of the land's secrets, the hidden water sources away from the main well, the ways of tracking, ensuring the ranch would prosper under honest hands. He even shared a quiet smoke with Tonkawa, a mutual respect forged in shared danger. When it was finally time for him to depart, he went to see Samuel one last time. The boy, playing with a carved wooden hawk Kachi had made for him, looked up and gave a gurgling laugh, reaching out with a sticky hand. Kachi allowed his stern features to soften into a rare, almost imperceptible smile. He touched the boy's head gently, a silent farewell. As Kachi rode away from Havenwood, the sun setting behind him, he was no longer just a solitary warrior. He was Kachi, the vow keeper, the guardian who had bridged two worlds out of an act of compassion. The trail ahead was still his own, but it was no longer quite as lonely. He had stared into the face of death and desperation, and chosen life, chosen honor. And in doing so, he had not only saved a child and brought justice to a terrorized land, but had also, perhaps, saved a part of himself. The tale of the Comanche warrior and the settler's baby would become a whisper on the plains, a legend told around campfires, a reminder that even in the harshest of lands, the most unlikely bonds could be forged, and the deepest vows could indeed be unbreakable. His silhouette against the fiery sky was that of a man who had found his peace, not in the absence of conflict, but in the fierce, unwavering embrace of a promise kept.
The year was 1876, and the memory of the war was a ghost that lingered in the hollows of the Appalachian Mountains long after the cannons had fallen silent. For Arthur Blackwood, the ghost was a constant companion. It sat with him by the fire, walked with him through the dense hemlock forests, and stood vigil over his cot as he slept. His cabin, perched high on a granite shoulder of the mountain, was less a home and more a fortress, built not against marauders, but against a world that no longer made sense. He had come here after Appomattox, a man hollowed out by what he had seen and done. The sharp scent of pine and damp earth was a balm against the phantom smell of gunpowder and blood. The silence, broken only by the cry of a hawk or the sighing of the wind through the tall timbers, was a mercy after the unending roar of battle. Here he had created a life of rigid order. He rose before the sun painted the eastern ridges, his movements precise and economical. He chopped wood, tended his small garden, hunted for his meat, and mended what was broken. Each task was a bulwark, a carefully laid stone in the wall he had built around his heart. The physical exhaustion it brought was a welcome anesthetic for his soul. His face was a map of his past, etched with lines of hardship around eyes, the color of a winter sky. His hands, though calloused and strong, moved with a quiet deliberation, whether he was skinning a rabbit or stitching a tear in his worn coat. He spoke little, even to himself, for words had a way of summoning the ghosts he worked so hard to keep at bay. His solitude was absolute, a self-imposed exile that had, over 11 years, become as much a part of him as his own bones. The man he had been before the warrior boy from Ohio, with a quick smile and a belief in simple truths, was a stranger he barely remembered. The mountains had taken him in, and in return, he had asked only to be left alone. The first sign of the world's intrusion was a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing, a flash of color that did not belong. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting through the trees in long golden shafts. Arthur had been splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar heartbeat in the quiet air. He froze, his hand tight on the hickory handle, every instinct honed by years of survival, both in war and in wilderness, screaming that something was wrong. He was not a man easily startled, but this was different. It was the wrongness of a painted fan in a blacksmith's shop, a piece of lace on a battlefield. He lowered the axe slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line. There it was again, not one flicker, but several. Pale blues, soft pinks, sullied yellows, the colors of worn calico and gingham, colors he had not seen in a decade. They moved like wraiths through the underbrush, stumbling, halting, and then pressing forward again. He counted them. 1, 2, 3. His mind struggled to process the number. It was an impossibility. 11. 11 women were emerging from the forest and into his clearing, their dresses torn and stained with mud, their faces smudged with dirt and despair. They looked like a flock of broken birds, their finery ruined, their steps faltering with exhaustion. One of them, a young woman with hair the color of straw, stumbled and fell to her knees, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Another, older and with a severe knot of graying hair, helped her up, her own face a mask of grim determination. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, huddled together, looking at his cabin as if it were both a deliverance and a new, terrifying threat. Leading them was a woman who stood a little apart from the rest. She was tall, and though her dress was as tattered as the others, she held herself with an erect posture that defied her circumstances. Her hair, a dark chestnut brown, had come loose from its pins and fell in waves around her shoulders. Her face was pale and drawn, but her eyes, a deep, clear green, met his across the clearing with a look that was not pleading, but assessing. It was a look that held fear, but also a bedrock of unbroken pride. Arthur remained motionless, a sentinel of weathered wood and homespun cloth. His first impulse was a cold, hard rejection. This was his sanctuary. His peace, however bleak, was a thing he had paid for in blood and memory, and he would not have it disturbed. They were from the world below, the world of towns and people and complications he had fled. They would bring its noise, its demands, its sorrows. He could feel the walls of his solitude trembling, and a raw, protective anger rose in him. He wanted to raise his voice, to tell them to turn back, to leave him to his ghosts. But then the woman in the lead took a hesitant step forward, and another. She walked toward him with a slow, measured gait, as if each step cost her something. The other 10 watched, their fear a palpable thing that seemed to shimmer in the air. As she drew closer, he could see the finer details of their desperation, the scraped hands, the haunted hollows beneath their eyes, the way they flinched when a branch snapped in the woods behind them. She stopped about 20 feet from him. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was raspy with thirst and fatigue, yet it carried a surprising strength. "Sir," she said, her breathing shallow. "My name is Eleanor Vance. These women are with me. We have fled the town of Providence." Arthur said nothing. His silence was a weapon, a shield, a vast, empty space he expected her to retreat from. He had used it to drive away the occasional lost trapper or prospector. But she did not retreat. She held his gaze, her chin held high. "The mayor," she continued, her voice gaining a thin thread of steel. "Mr. Donovan, he has become a tyrant. He has taken our family's lands, our father's businesses. He sought to distribute us as property to his men." The words were spoken with a clipped, precise anger that hinted at a much deeper well of fury and terror. "We could not abide it. We chose the wilderness over that." He saw it then, in the eyes of all of them. They were not simply lost, they were refugees. He looked at the young girl who had fallen, now leaning heavily on an older woman. He saw a girl no older than 16, her face streaked with tears, clutching the hand of a woman who might have been her mother. He saw fear, yes, but he also saw a defiant courage that resonated with a part of him he thought had long since turned to ash. They had chosen the unknown dangers of the mountains over the certain degradation of men. It was a soldier's choice. Eleanor Vance took a deep breath, the effort seeming to cost her dearly. "We have been walking for 3 days. We have no food and little water left. We are not asking for charity. We are asking for sanctuary, just for a time, a place to rest, to be safe from his men, who we know will be hunting us. We will work. We will earn our keep. We ask only for your protection." The word hung in the air between them. Protection. It was a word that belonged to his other life, to the man who had worn a blue uniform and made promises he could not always keep. He had failed to protect so many. His friends, his captain, the boy from his own town who had died in his arms at Cold Harbor. The weight of those failures pressed down on him. He looked away from her intense gaze, toward the dark, silent woods that ringed his clearing. He could send them away. It would be the sensible thing to do. Their presence was a danger, a beacon that would draw Donovan's corruption up his mountain. But as he looked back at them, at their exhausted, hopeful, terrified faces, he saw not 11 women, but a reflection of his own flight. They were seeking what he had sought, a refuge from a world that had become monstrous. A long, heavy silence stretched out. The women watched him, barely breathing. Eleanor Vance stood her ground, her face betraying nothing, though he could see the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to pull up from the very soles of his feet, Arthur gave a curt nod toward the barn. "The barn," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "There's hay, it's dry, you can stay the night." It was not a welcome, but it was not a refusal. A collective sigh of relief, soft as a whisper, passed through the group of women. Eleanor Vance's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, the rigid control she had maintained finally cracking. She closed her eyes for a brief second. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. Arthur turned away without another word and walked to the well, the rhythmic creak of the handle filling the sudden quiet. He worked the pump until a bucket was full of cold, clear water. He carried it over and set it down near them, his movements stiff and deliberate. He did not look at them as they fell upon it, sharing the dipper with a desperate, grateful reverence. He retreated to his cabin, shutting the door behind him. But the silence he had cherished now felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the awareness of 11 heartbeats in his barn, and the world he had run from was no longer down in the valley. It was sleeping just 100 feet from his door. The first days were a study in mutual suspicion. Arthur kept to his routines with a fierce, almost punishing rigidity, as if by doing so he could assert his control over the disruption they represented. He would emerge from his cabin at dawn to find them already stirring, their movements quiet and tentative, like mice in a lion's den. He would chop wood, and the sound of his axe would be the only conversation between his world and theirs. He left a portion of his hunted gamia brace of rabbits, a wild turkeyon, a stump between the cabin and the barn, a silent, functional offering. He never watched them retrieve it, but he was aware of their presence with every nerve in his body. The women, for their part, treated him with a cautious distance. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes skittering away whenever he looked in their direction. Eleanor Vance was their clear leader, organizing them with a quiet efficiency that he could not help but notice. They cleaned the barn until it was spotless, mended their tattered clothing with thread he had left on the stump alongside a slab of bacon, and took turns keeping a low fire burning behind the barn for cooking. Its smoke carefully managed to dissipate among the trees. They did not intrude. They did not ask for more than he gave. They existed in his periphery, a silent, bustling community of ghosts in calico. But the arrangement was an uneasy truce, not a peace. He felt their eyes on him as he worked, a constant, unnerving scrutiny. He was an enigma to them, the grim, silent man of the mountain. And they were a threat to him, a breach in his defenses. His nights were more restless than ever. The faces of the dead in his dreams were now joined by the living faces of the women in his barn. He was responsible for them. The thought was a burr under his skin, an unwelcome weight on his shoulders. He had chosen solitude precisely to be free of such burdens. One afternoon, a week after their arrival, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The wind began to howl through the pines, a mournful sound like a thing grieving. A storm was coming, one of the violent, sudden tempests that could tear through the mountains with savage force. Arthur secured the shutters on his cabin and checked the livestock pen, his movements quick and sure. He glanced toward the barn. It was sturdy, but old. The wind was already plucking at its shingles. He hesitated for only a moment, a war raging within him. His cabin was his inner sanctum, the one place that was wholly his. To let them inside was to surrender the last bastion of his isolation. But the image of the young girl with the straw-colored hair, her face pale with fear, flashed in his mind. He strode to the barn, the first fat drops of rain splattering against his shoulders. He threw open the heavy door. The women looked up, startled, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a single lantern. Eleanor stood at once. "The storm," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble against the rising wind. "It will be a bad one. The loft isn't safe. Get your things. You'll stay in the cabin." He did not wait for an answer, turning and walking back to his small house, leaving the door agape. A moment later they filed in, a silent, dripping procession. They huddled together near the door, looking small and out of place in the spare, masculine space. The cabin was one room, dominated by a large stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and his cot in the corner. There was nowhere for them to go that was not in his immediate vicinity. The storm broke with a roar, rain lashing against the roof and windows in a furious torrent. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the cabin. With each clap, some of the younger women would flinch, their eyes wide. Arthur ignored them, stoking the fire until it blazed, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The enforced proximity was a physical discomfort, like a collar that was too tight. The air, once scented only with wood smoke and old leather, was now filled with the foreign smells of damp wool, lavender soap they must have carried, and fear. Eleanor came to stand near the hearth, extending her hands to the warmth. "We are in your debt again, Mr. Blackwood." The barn roof might not have held, he grunted, not looking at her. It was a statement of fact, not kindness. They spent the long hours of the storm in near silence. The women found spaces on the floor, sharing the few blankets they had. Arthur remained in his chair by the fire, a sentinel in his own home. But as the night wore on, the rigid silence began to thaw, eroded by the shared experience of the storm's fury. One of the older women, a stout, motherly figure named Martha, began to hum a soft tune, a wordless lullaby that seemed to calm the frayed nerves in the room. Another, a quiet woman named Abigail, began to speak in a low voice to the girl beside her, her words a soothing murmur. Arthur found himself listening. He learned their names not as a collective, but as individuals. Rose, the young one who had fallen. Clara, who was a skilled herbalist. Josephine and Beatrice, who were sisters. Each name was a small chip in the wall he had built. He learned snippets of their lives before Providence had soured stories of gardens, of church socials, of families now broken. Late in the night, the storm raged on, but a kind of exhausted peace had settled inside the cabin. He must have dozed off because he was startled awake by a soft cry. He opened his eyes to see Eleanor kneeling beside one of the women, whispering to her. In the dim firelight, he saw that Eleanor was holding the woman's hand, her face a portrait of gentle compassion. He had only ever seen her pride and her strength. This glimpse of tenderness was unexpected, and it disarmed him. He rose and poured a cup of water from the bucket by the door, walking over to her. He knelt, offering the cup. "Here," he said gruffly. Eleanor looked up, surprised. Her green eyes met his in the flickering light, and for the first time he saw not a refugee or a burden, but simply a woman trying to hold her world together. "Thank you," she whispered, and took the cup, helping the other woman drink. He retreated to his chair, but something had shifted. The cabin no longer felt invaded. It felt occupied. The silence he returned to was no longer his own. It was a shared silence, layered with the soft sounds of breathing, of sleeping women who had placed their trust in his roof and his honor. For the first time in 11 years, Arthur Blackwood was not entirely alone, and the feeling was as terrifying as it was unfamiliar. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. The women returned to the barn, but the invisible wall between them and Arthur had been breached. The shared night had changed the dynamic. Their morning greetings were a little bolder, his grunted replies a little less harsh. He found a basket of wild berries on the stump one morning, left by Clara. He left a length of rope he had no use for in return, knowing their mended clothes were held together by little more than hope. It was a silent, bartering language of mutual acknowledgement. Eleanor began to approach him more directly, not with demands, but with questions. She asked about the trees, the animals, the signs of changing weather. She was a keen observer, her intelligence sharp and practical. He found himself answering her, his explanations clipped and factual, but he answered nonetheless. "That's witch hazel," he told her one day, pointing with his chin. "Good for poultices." "And that bird call?" she asked, tilting her head. "Wood thrush. Means the air is clear." During these brief exchanges, he learned more about their flight. Mayor Donovan was not just corrupt, he was a man of unchecked appetites. After seizing control of the town's assets through fraudulent debts and intimidation, he had declared the unmarried daughters and widows of the ruined men to be wards of the town, planning to use them as chattel to reward his loyal thugs. Eleanor, a schoolteacher and the daughter of the former Judge Donovan, had deposed, had organized the escape in secret, a desperate gamble for their lives and dignity. "He saw us as spoils of his little war," she said one evening, her voice cold with a tightly controlled rage. They were standing by the woodpile, the sky bleeding into a soft twilight. "He underestimated us. He thought because we were women, we were weak. He was wrong." Arthur looked at her, at the fierce pride in her profile, and felt a stir of something he had not felt since he had charged a line of grey uniforms, reluctant admiration. "Being underestimated can be an advantage," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. She turned to him, a small, surprised smile touching her lips for the first time. It transformed her face, softening the hard lines of worry. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it can." But their fragile peace was not destined to last. The mountain was a sanctuary, but it was not impregnable. One morning, while checking his trap lines high on the ridge, Arthur saw them. 3 men on horseback, picking their way up the old logging trail that snaked up the mountain's flank. They were still miles away, but their intent was clear. They wore badges that glinted in the sun, but they moved with the predatory slouch of hired muscle, not lawmen, Donovan's men. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, settled in his stomach. He raced back to the cabin, his long strides eating up the ground. He did not burst into the clearing. He slowed, controlling his breathing, and approached the barn with a calm he did not feel. He found Eleanor outside, showing Rose how to properly gut a fish. He spoke in a low, urgent voice. 3 riders, coming up the south trail. They'll be here within the hour." Panic flared in Eleanor's eyes, but she smothered it instantly. She straightened, her knuckles white where she gripped the knife. "What do we do?" "Get everyone inside the barn. Stay quiet. Bar the door from the inside. Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear," he commanded. His mind was already working, clicking through tactics and terrain like the tumblers of a lock. "Erase any signs of you being here, the fire, the washing, all of it." The women moved with a frantic, whispered efficiency born of terror. Within minutes, the clearing was as it had always been, empty and austere. Arthur watched as the heavy barn door swung shut, the sound of the wooden bar sliding into place echoing in the sudden silence. He took his rifle from the cabin. It felt unnaturally heavy in his hands, a tool of a life he had tried to bury. He did not want this. He did not want their violence and their greed to stain his mountain. But his choice had been made the moment he offered them the shelter of his barn. He did not wait for them to reach his clearing. He circled around, moving through the dense woods with a silence born of long practice. He positioned himself on a rocky outcrop overlooking the trail, his body concealed by a thicket of mountain laurel. He laid the rifle on the rock before him, its cold steel a familiar, unwelcome comfort. He watched them approach. They were coarse men, laughing and talking loudly, confident in their power and purpose. One of them was the mayor's chief enforcer, a hulking brute named Shaw. Arthur knew him by reputation from the one time a year he went to town for salt and iron goods. Shaw was a man who enjoyed cruelty. They reined in their horses at the bottom of the trail leading directly to his clearing. "He's up here somewhere," Shaw's voice boomed, echoing in the quiet forest. "The old hermit. Donovan wants to know if he's seen a flock of stray hens." The other two laughed. "Maybe he's keeping them warm for us," one jeered. Arthur's finger tightened on the trigger. The cold, disciplined part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive in the war, took over. One shot, and he could drop Shaw from his saddle. But that would mean a fight. That would mean killing again, and the other two were armed. It was a risk. Instead, he chose another tactic. He waited until they were halfway up the steep, narrow path. Then he raised the rifle and fired. Not at them, but at the face of the shale cliff just above their heads. The crack of the rifle shot was like a thunderclap, shattering the peace of the forest. The bullet struck the unstable rock, and with a deafening groan, a cascade of shale and loose rock slid down onto the path. It was not a massive landslide, but it was enough. The horses screamed and reared, their eyes wild with terror. One man was thrown, landing hard, with a cry of pain. The other two fought to control their panicked mounts as stones rained down around them. "Ambush," one of them screamed. Shaw cursed, wrestling his horse back from the edge of the trail. He scanned the trees, his eyes wide and searching, but he could see nothing. The forest was silent again, impenetrable. "Who's up there?" he roared, his bravado shaken. Arthur remained perfectly still, a part of the rock and shadow. He did not fire again. The single shot, the rock slide, the unsettling silence, it was a message. This mountain was not undefended. It had teeth. For a long moment, they hesitated. The injured man groaned on the ground. The path ahead was blocked. The woods around them felt alive with unseen menace. Shaw made his decision. "Get him up. We're getting out of here," he snarled. "But we'll be back. You tell that hermit we'll be back for him and for the women." They hauled their injured companion onto his horse and retreated back down the mountain, casting fearful glances over their shoulders. Arthur watched them go, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He waited until they were long gone before he lowered the rifle, his hands trembling slightly. He had not taken a life. He had protected his own. He had protected them. The realization settled in him, not with triumph, but with a profound and weary sadness. The war had found him after all. The days that followed the encounter with Shaw's men were fraught with a new tension. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It had a face and a voice that promised to return. The women stayed closer to the barn, their quiet industry now shadowed by a constant vigilance. Arthur found himself watching the trails, his rifle never far from his hand. The shared danger forged a new, stronger bond between them, an unspoken alliance against the world below. Eleanor sought him out more often, her questions no longer just about survival in the wild, but about strategy. "They will come back," she said one evening, her voice low. "Donovan is not a man who accepts defiance." "I know," Arthur replied, his eyes on the darkening horizon. "What will we do?" she asked, and for the first time he heard a note of genuine appeal in her voice. She was not asking for his orders, but for his counsel. It was a subtle but significant shift. "We prepare," he said. He began to teach them things he had learned in the war, how to move silently through the woods, how to spot a broken twig or an unnatural depression in the leaves that signaled a man's passage. He showed Eleanor the high ridges and hidden hollows of his mountain, pointing out vantage points and escape routes. He was no longer just their reluctant host, he had become their commander. In turn, they brought a semblance of life to his stark existence. Clara planted a small herb garden near the barn, its fragrant leaves a stark contrast to the scent of pine and dirt. Martha, it turned out, had a beautiful voice, and sometimes in the evenings her soft singing would drift from the barn, a melody of heartbreaking sweetness that stirred something deep within him. Rose, having lost her initial terror of him, would sometimes leave a clumsily carved bird or a wildflower on his doorstep, small, shy offerings that he found himself unable to discard. His cabin began to change. One day he found a woven mat by his door, another, a jar of spiced preserves on his table. They were small incursions, gentle annexations of his space that he found he no longer had the will to resist. The silence he had once craved now often felt empty, and he would find himself pausing in his work, listening for the distant sound of their voices. The confrontation, when it came, was sooner than he expected. It was a grey, overcast morning, a week after the rock slide. A heavy mist clung to the mountainside, muffling sound and turning the world into a landscape of ghosts. He was on his way to the spring when he saw them. Not 3 men this time, but 7, led by Mayor Donovan himself. Donovan was a portly man with a florid face and eyes like polished river stones, cold and hard. They were moving with a grim purpose, spreading out to approach the clearing from multiple sides. There was no time for warnings, no time for escape. Arthur melted back into the woods, circling around to get his rifle from the cabin. As he slipped inside, he saw the women huddling at the barn door, their faces white with terror. Eleanor met his gaze across the clearing, and in her eyes he saw not surrender, but a question. He gave her a short, sharp nod, a signal they had prearranged. Barricade. The women scrambled back inside, the barn door slamming shut. Arthur took a deep breath, the familiar coldness settling over him. He grabbed the rifle and a pouch of cartridges. He would not let them be taken. Donovan and his men stepped into the clearing, their guns held ready. They saw the closed cabin door, the silent barn. Blackwood, Donovan's voice was oily with false confidence. I know you're in there, and I know you have my property. Send the women out, and I might be inclined to forget your interference. The cabin door creaked open. Arthur stepped out, his rifle held loosely at his side, not aimed, but ready. He stood on the porch, a lone, immovable figure against the grey backdrop of the logs. They are not your property, Donovan, he said, his voice calm and clear. They are free women, and they are under my protection. Donovan's face darkened. Protection? You are one man, an old soldier whose war is long over. I have 6 men with me. Do not be a fool. I've faced worse odds, Arthur said flatly. Shaw, standing beside Donovan, sneered. Let's just rush him, Major. He can't get us all. He might get you, Shaw, Arthur said, his eyes locking with the bigger man's. And I don't miss. An uneasy silence fell. Donovan's men shifted, their confidence wavering in the face of Arthur's unnerving calm. But the mayor was not a man to be deterred by a single rifle. The barn, Donovan ordered, gesturing with his pistol. 2 of you, break down that door. The rest of you, keep him pinned. 2 men started toward the barn. Arthur knew he couldn't stop them all. He raised his rifle, preparing to make a choice he did not want to make. But then, something unexpected happened. From the open hayloft door of the barn, a volley of objects rained down on the 2 men. Not bullets, but rocks, pieces of firewood, an old iron skillet. The attack was sudden and furious. One of the men yelled in pain as a heavy piece of wood struck his shoulder. They staggered back, looking up in disbelief. Standing in the hayloft opening were Eleanor, Martha, and Beatrice, their faces grim with determination, their arms full of more makeshift ammunition. At the same moment, the small windows on the side of the barn slid open, and Clara and Josephine appeared, armed with buckets of a noxious, steaming liquid from Clara's herb stores, which they flung at the men below. The men howled as the stinging concoction hit them, retreating in confusion. Donovan stared, flabbergasted. This was not in his calculations. He had come for timid, frightened women, not a coordinated, resisting force. The distraction was all Arthur needed. He fired, not at a man, but at the pistol in Shaw's hand. The shot was perfect. The pistol flew from Shaw's grasp with a metallic clang, his hand numb and tingling. Shaw cried out, staring at his empty hand in shock. Now it was 7 guns against 1, but the odds had shifted. Donovan's men were rattled, their focus split between the implacable man on the porch and the surprisingly ferocious women in the barn. "This mountain is my home," Arthur said, his voice ringing with an authority he had not felt in years. "These women have found sanctuary here. You are trespassing. You will leave now, or you will be carried out." He took a step forward, off the porch, his rifle held at the ready. He was no longer just a hermit defending his solitude. He was a man defending his home, his people. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. They were his people. Donovan looked from Arthur's steady gaze to the determined faces of the women in the barn. He saw his men, shaken and uncertain. He saw his plan, his simple application of force, unraveling in the misty air. His bluster deflated, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He had misjudged not only the women, but the quiet man on the mountain. Humiliation warred with prudence. Prudence won. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he spat, his face mottled with rage. He gestured angrily at his men. "Fall back. Let's go." They retreated, dragging their discouraged companions with them. They did not look back. Arthur stood motionless in the center of the clearing, his rifle still ready, until the last sound of their passage had faded into the mist. Slowly, the barn door creaked open. The women emerged, their faces pale but triumphant. Eleanor came toward him, her eyes shining. She stopped before him, looking at the rifle in his hands, then up at his face. "It's over," she said, her voice a breath of wonder. Arthur lowered the rifle, the tension draining out of him, leaving him feeling bone-weary but strangely light. "For now," he said. He looked at the women, at their brave, determined faces. They had not cowered. They had fought, for themselves and for each other. He looked at his cabin, and then at the barn. The space between them no longer felt like a divide. It felt like a common ground, a place that belonged to all of them. The silence that descended was not empty or lonely. It was a shared peace, earned together. He had thought he came to the mountains to be alone, to escape the bonds of duty and care. He now understood he had only been waiting. In the weeks and months that followed, a new kind of life took root on the mountain. The barn was no longer a temporary shelter but an extension of the homestead. With timber Arthur felled and hewed, they added a sturdy lean-to for a proper kitchen and a common room. The small patch of a garden exploded into a sprawling plot under the women's collective care, promising a harvest that would see them all through the winter. The fear of Donovan's return slowly faded, replaced by the rhythms of a shared existence. The sounds of the clearing changed. The solitary thud of Arthur's axe was now often accompanied by the murmur of conversation, the melody of Martha's singing as she worked, and sometimes the bright, surprising sound of laughter. Rose's laughter, especially, seemed to have the power to smooth the hard edges of his soul. Arthur found his own rigid routine softening, bending to accommodate the life that now pulsed around him. He still rose at dawn, but now it was to the smell of coffee and baking bread. He still hunted, but now he was providing for a family. He taught the younger women to track and to fish, and discovered a patient, quiet satisfaction in the role of teacher. He found himself speaking more, sharing stories of the wilderness, though never of the war. He did not need to. They seemed to understand that some territories were too scarred to be revisited. His relationship with Eleanor deepened into a quiet, powerful partnership. They were the twin pillars around which this new community was built. They rarely needed to speak to understand one another. A shared glance across the dinner table, a nod as they planned the day's work, it was a language of mutual respect and a slowly growing affection that neither of them dared to name. She was the heart of their home, her steady strength and intelligence guiding the women. He was its guardian, his quiet vigilance, a comforting shield around them all. One evening in late autumn, he was sitting on his porch, cleaning his rifle, a task that had become more habit than necessity. The air was crisp with the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The sun was setting, bathing the valley below in a fiery orange glow. Eleanor came and sat on the step below him, holding a steaming mug in her hands. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the sky bruise into nightfall. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly, her voice barely disturbing the quiet. "The silence? Being alone?" Arthur stopped his work, his hands still on the cool metal of the rifle. He considered her question. He thought of the 11 years of profound, echoing loneliness. The self-imposed sentence he had served. He had believed that solitude was his penance and his only possible peace. He looked at the warm light spilling from the windows of the cabin and the new common room. He could hear the low murmur of voices from within, the clatter of plates being washed. He thought of the feeling of sitting at a long table, surrounded by people who depended on him, and whom he was startled to realize, depended on in return. "My silence was just a different kind of war," he said, his voice low and reflective. "I was just fighting it by myself." He looked down at her. In the fading light, he could see the warmth in her eyes. She reached out and gently laid her hand on his arm, her touch sending a jolt of surprising warmth through him. "You're not by yourself anymore, Arthur," she said softly. He looked at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. A peace he had never known, deeper and more real than any solitude, settled over him. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but life, in all its messy, unpredictable, and heartbreaking beauty, had found its way inside. It had come in the form of 11 desperate women, and it had not destroyed his sanctuary. It had transformed it into a home. He slowly covered her hand with his own, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. And for the first time in a very long time, Arthur Blackwood felt that he had finally won.